the GovUK OneLogin, which is a technology that UK government uses for authentication and identity verification. And as part of that exercise, we looked at the implementation of GovUK OneLogin. So that is what this presentation is based on. It is not probably highly detailed from the technology point of view, but it demonstrates the characteristics of this service and the possibility of perhaps implementing this within a project that you participate in, given that this is a strategic direction for UK government. So the agenda would be give you some background information, then go through the GovUK OneLogin architecture, then give you an example of an implementation scenario, how we tried to look at different ways to implement OneLogin for an existing solution within the VSA. Then I'll show you a proof of concept if it works still. We have created a working sample of the service that authenticates itself against the integration environment that the digital office of the government provided to us. So I'll show that. I can't promise that this is going to 100% work, but maybe if nothing happens, at least a week ago, everything was fine. And then I'll give you some practical advice on how to integrate and what needs to be done if any of the projects would require to use this service. So this is something that we'll go through. And
watch this video. If you want to get rid of monitoring spirits,
I think somebody should put himself or herself on mute because there's some background noise coming from. Okay. So the next section will cover the OneLogin architecture. And it's some basics. You probably would know some of them, and I'll try to focus on the things that are specific to OneLogin. But there is nothing different in this service from the services that are from the IDPs that you are used to. So there are some specifics, though. So the origin, this was introduced by the department which was used to be called CDDO, which is Central Digital and Data Office. This department doesn't exist anymore. There was reorganization, and actually this month they merged with the GDS, Geospatial Commission, Incubator for AI, and now it is called Government Digital Service and part of the Department for Science, Innovation and Technology. So that department now owns OneLogin and owns this service and provides this service across all the departments within the government. The coverage currently, there is over 40 GovUK services that are currently using OneLogin. And the architecturally, this is a strategic solution for GovUK authentication and identity verification. So the plan is we have discussed this with the architecture group and with the group that implements and introduces OneLogin for services that require it, would be to cover about 100 new services in the course of 2025. And on the right, I just gave you an example of what type of services are currently being used. It's all public information. You could just Google it and find this is available for the general public. So in terms of the protocols and the standards which are behind OneLogin, you probably are familiar with OAuth 2.0, which is the authorization framework. And essentially the point of using that is to access resources on behalf of a user, but without exposing the credentials of the user. And it is generally accepted all over the place. It's a standard for online authorization. And it's quite, it's not new, it's probably like 20, 15 years old. And on top of that, a bit later, there was another protocol built, which is called OpenID Connect or OIDC, and it extends that protocol and adds an identity layer. So while OAuth 2 handles authorization, OpenID Connect handles authentication. So OAuth handles what you can do, and OpenID Connect handles who you are. So GovUK OneLogin, what is it? It's pretty much an IDP. It's a service provider, identity service provider that is OpenID Connect and OAuth 2 compliant. That's what it is, and it's no different from what you use. For example, when you authenticate with your Hotmail into the services that you use, or when you use the Google account to authenticate and use the service that is available on the web. What is the sequence of events here? So you are building this service. You don't want to handle the authentication and the credentials of the users that use that service. So you are the relying party. You would rely on an IDP. And in our particular case, this IDP is called GovUK OneLogin, and it's an OpenID provider. So your service asks a user to sign in or create an account. If your service needs confidence that the user is saying that the user is correct in saying who he is, then there will be an additional process. The reason this box here, identify, proofing, and verification, is outside of the gray box is because this is something that happens, that takes a long time. So pretty much during the registration, the time delay between the event number 1, which is sending the request, and receiving the confirmation, event number 4, can be, for example, 2 weeks, because this needs to happen. In the most complex cases, the person can actually need to have a face-to-face meeting with somebody in an office to show his identity or to provide some documentation and to be verified that he represents himself in a correct way. But in the simplest case, where you obviously set up username and password and nothing else is required, then this process pretty much is instant. So that bit doesn't take any time at all, because the identity proofing isn't required, and that is also possible with OneLogin. So this is essentially the sequence of events and the service it provides. If we go to the next level of detail, I'll just show you this sequence diagram. This is a standard OpenID Connect process. Any service provider that uses OpenID knows about this. It's all described in the standards, and you are building this service. You would like to use the IDP GovUK OneLogin. You call the endpoint called authorize, and that name is defined by the standard. So the service makes an authorization request to this endpoint. Then this process number 2 is in fact this process here that I've just described. So once that is complete, you are receiving the authorization code. But like I said, if the person is first time, if it is the first time the user is using GovUK OneLogin, that process can take some time. If he would like to use a service with a high level of which requires high level of confidence in identity verification. But in the simplest cases, like in our cases that we used in the proof of concept, this is pretty much an instant process. So the authorization code then is used to look to call an API called token endpoint. And then you receive two tokens, one ID token, which is defined by OpenID Connect standard, and it's the token that is used to identify who you are. An access token is the token that is used by this by the service to identify what resources you are able to access. Then, using the access token, you call user info endpoint, an ID token, and you receive the user attributes. Essentially, the user attributes is what the IDP, OneLogin, knows about the person who is trying to authenticate. And at that point, he uses the agreement of the user to provide that information to that service. So an example here would be if you would like to show your picture to that service, you will have to agree to that. If you would like to show your passport details to that service, you will have to agree to that, and so on. So that user info endpoint call provides the user attributes that you would then use in the business process, whatever your service implements here. And then finally, once the function and the business process is complete, you call the logout endpoint and you end up in the service logout landing page. So there's nothing specific here about OneLogin. It's the standard implementation of OpenID Connect. The only thing that is worth mentioning here is the user info endpoint, which provides a particular type of information about the user that is only specific to a government service, OneLogin. And we'll go through this in the next couple of slides. So there are two concepts here, which is one of them is identity confidence, and the other one is level of authentication. And GovUK uses so-called vectors of trust, and the service can use these to request the right level of authentication. And they have set up the vector value of CL, which is credential low, and this requires your user only to have username and password combination, and you only should have this option if the service does not hold any personal information about your user. So essentially it's username and password, and that's it. And then anything other than that would use the medium level of protection, which is credential medium. And here the vector would require to have username and password combination, as well as two-factor authentication and one-time password received through SMS or authenticator app. And if this level is set, then you can actually request the identity attributes from the user info endpoint. If you set the service, if you configure the service at this level, you wouldn't be able to do that. So that's the first concept for OneLogin, the level of authentication. And then finally, there is a identity confidence concept as well, and it is defined by this GPG 45, which is a government policy guidance, and it's a number of documents how government handles the identity verification, the confidence in checking the identity, and there are pretty much 4 levels here. In fact, there are 5 levels, but level 0 means that you don't have any identity confidence. Essentially, you have the username and password, the user logs in, and you know nothing about him. That's the level 0. But 1, 2, 3, and 4 are progressively higher, and each level addresses a specific set of risks. And as you go higher in this hierarchy, it addresses more and more groups of risks. So, for example, P1, which is a low confidence, identity confidence. It's the basic level, and essentially it protects against so-called synthetic identities, which is essentially a set of attributes that do not relate to any particular person. It's completely fictional. As you go up in this hierarchy, the medium level would add some information, would reduce the risk of accepting imposters that have information about the person from that is not in the public domain. So essentially, for example, if somebody in the HR department would extract the information about a particular, like maybe national insurance number, maybe the personal address, the name, maybe the relatives' names, and uses that to impersonate somebody, then this would be the kind of risks that this level would mitigate, and you would not be able to. So the risk of such people at that level would be very low. And then you go progressively higher into level 3 and level 4. However, those two levels are not covered by OneLogin, but essentially the high level, it is somebody who impersonates somebody, but without the biological similarity. So essentially everything is similar, but the face is different, or the fingerprint is different. So the only mismatch between the claimed identity and the person is his biology. So it is biometric information. And then very high is somebody who is wearing a mask or something like this. So it's even the biology is similar. And this is all defined, but obviously OneLogin doesn't go to that level of detail. A good example of P3 would be if you saw the Netflix series Ripley, I think it's called. There was a person impersonating as somebody else in that movie. And a good example for P4 would be the Day of Jackal, the series from Netflix, where the person was wearing masks and doing all sorts of nasty stuff. Those two levels are not addressed, but it does provide the confidence of low and medium level, the processes that are implemented. So how this is done, it is defined in scopes and claims. In scopes, we have the information about the user that contains his email, and also the fact that the email is verified or not. So verification is obviously something that happens during the registration and during the login. Same for the phone number, the actual number, and the fact it was verified or not. And then in the claims, which are requested using the scope, you would get different levels of information depending on the confidence level 1 or 2 that you have set up. And they are the core identity, which is your name, date of birth. Yeah, name, date of birth. So then we have the address, which is the postal address of that person. Then we have the passport details. Then we have the driving license details. And finally, this one is the return code, which is sort of the most confidential level of information. If somebody doesn't go through verification successfully, that fact is also recorded. And even though later the verification completes successfully, you would still have that flag set, and it would provide the information about what kind of problem was during the verification process. That's essentially the details of the OneLogin architecture and functionality that I wanted to go through in this section. And I will go to the next one, which is the implementation scenario. And essentially what happens here, the B2B setup is setting up the trust between the two companies. The company has established the trust relationship between the two domains, and what is required to assign the access to the application that runs on the DVSA domain is for somebody to allocate permissions, and that somebody is the power user, to the user that requires access. And that is only possible if there is a B2B trust established between two companies, which requires the contractual obligation, and the contract should be signed between two companies. But that has quite a huge advantage because you rely on the external company to manage its users. You don't need to keep track of who comes, who goes, who changes roles, and what permissions need to be reassigned. It's all done by the external party. So B2B architecture is quite successfully implemented in many business scenarios, including this one, where you have users within your partner that does user management, does the joiners, leavers, and movers process, so-called JML process, and this is all happening sort of outside of your organization because you trust that company to do that. So that's one scenario, B2B, and then the second approach is B2C, which is essentially when you have an external user. It needs to authenticate, and for that you create a B2C tenant, which is very similar to your Active Directory or as it is called now, Enter ID. But it's sitting separately. It's essentially a list of external or a database of external people that are able to access resources within your domain, within your company. And it is set up as an Active Directory B2C tenant. And the process is once the user is, so for that particular solution that we have reviewed, the process was on Dynamics, the user is set up, then we would synchronize that user with the Active Directory. The Active Directory then would contain the entry for that user that he is able to go and authenticate into the application. And there was a number of services used. So first of all, this ID synchronizer, which was synchronizing the accounts between the Dynamics platform and Active Directory B2C tenant. And then there was also the REST API for the temporary passwords, and so on. So this is the solution that was currently working, but we were looking to replace that with OneLogin. So in terms of the implementation of OneLogin, the conclusion we came to is there is no need to do that for the B2B scenario. And if we implemented OneLogin for that, it would be sort of redundant because it's going to be an additional layer of trust. And since two companies already have contractual obligations and they already trust the users to do their job in the external organization, to have OneLogin on top of that would be essentially a redundant feature. It will be a different level of authentication for the people who are already trusted to the organization. So what we have decided in this discovery that any users that are in the B2B trust should be excluded from the scope of the OneLogin implementation. And the other important feature as well is B2B authentication allows the external party to do user management. And as we discovered later, OneLogin doesn't support B2B and doesn't allow user management to be done by an external party. So the user management still needs to be done by the organization that uses that service. But for the external users that use B2C, we did sort of a discovery process. So we identified a set of requirements that we wanted to check. So essentially, we wanted to check if OneLogin can provide that. what is the current state, and is it going to improve the situation or not. And we came up with these 8 criteria. The first one is about unified identity management. So the solution must minimize the administration effort and reduce cost. Single sign-on and multi-factor authentication are 2 obvious things that need to be supported. We wanted to check B2B ability of OneLogin as well. Enhanced security, that was also the requirement. And by that, I mean the advanced identity verification based on government-issued document checks. And that's essentially what OneLogin does the best. Scalability and flexibility, that's the obvious non-functional requirement. Then GDS compliance. And finally, whether this is government digital office strategy compliant or not. So the results that we came up with in the end of the discovery was like this. So these are all those 8 requirements. And if we look at the current status, the services that were running, those 3 services that we reviewed, we did not find the evidence that this is a unified identity management. In fact, it wasn't unified at all. It was a tenant per application, and if one person uses 3 services, there will be 3 accounts, for example. It's not a single sign-on for that same reason as well. It was multi-factor authentication in both cases. When we looked at the B2B ability and we discussed it with the architects at the digital office, they confirmed that this is not implemented and is not on the roadmap either. And it is understandable because OneLogin's purpose is not to establish the connection between businesses. It is to verify the identity of the general public, essentially. So therefore, they do not plan to implement it, although if they wanted to, it would be possible as well. But it is a no. And then enhanced security, basically verification against the government-issued documents. It's yes and no for the current. Scalability was accepted, flexibility was acceptable in both cases. GDS compliance as well. And then finally, government digital office pushes for the implementation of OneLogin. So it is the strategy, and they would like to transfer all the services into that service. And therefore, sort of this was yes for OneLogin and no for the current status. And overall, it seemed like it's a logical and good step to go and implement OneLogin. So we then came up with a number of solutions how to implement it, and that's what I wanted to show you here. If you remember on that diagram, we had the synchronizer, we had the OTP, the TOTP REST API. What we suggested is to implement OneLogin as an IDP, which would contain the directory of users. We would still keep the Active Directory or Entra ID B2C tenant, sorry, not tenant, B2C service, but it will be just a relay. So whenever the request to authenticate would come to the relay, it will be passed to the external IDP, and then the authentication would be performed by the external party. And we would make some of the components of the current architecture redundant as well by implementing this path. And then another variation of this is essentially we don't even need the relay. We could just go directly. And this is what we implemented in the proof of concept. And this would be simpler, but this design would provide a little bit more transparency and ability to monitor the traffic, because we could use the inbuilt monitoring tools within Azure platform if we implement it as a relay. So now I just wanted to show you what it looks like. So the service currently is implemented on my local machine. It is running in the Docker container. And this is the front page. It should display just sort of a front page of a service, description of the service, and continue button would be the invitation to use it. But instead, this is a stub, and it is built using the templates that they have provided, and it's possible to configure various parameters here. So here is your level of confidence, second factor authentication, HTTP method, and so on. So we will not ask for any claims. We haven't tested this scenario, but essentially we could connect to the integration environment of the GovUK, and they have provided us with the access to that. And we can sign in. I, for example, register. So we have the second factor, which I configured on my Microsoft Authenticator app. And 4. No. 3, 2, 8, 8, 1, 2. Yeah, and this is where you're supposed to see the service and the business functionality, but it just returns the attributes of the response. So here's your ID token, here's your access token, here is the user info response with the email and various other parameters. And once the business process completes, you click on the logout and you should be redirected back to the sign out page on your service. So similarly, we could show potentially the registration process here. Oh, sorry, I forgot to uncheck this. So we could also, I could show you the creation of the account on OneLogin. So if personal email here. And check the 6-digit code in the email. Two, 4, 9, 7, 5, 3. Yeah, now it wants to authenticate. Sorry, use the second factor here. So I'll choose the text message. Or actually, maybe, yeah, text message. So I got the code 42770. And now I have created an account on gov.uk, so I can now use the service here, and as you see, all the details that I provided are now used here as well, including my phone number. So this is a stub which is pretty much empty, but it is written in Java, and we use the sample code that they have provided. Okay, and finally, there's a section on some practical details here, what would be required to implement this service. The first important bit is called, it's almost like a contract, except it's not legally binding. It's called Memorandum of Understanding. So if this service is implemented for any government department, there has to be an agreement between that department and GDS about using this. And it is a legal requirement. It needs to be done, and it takes time. It's not too long, but it can take up to 8 weeks. And it is done per each government department. So if DVSA, for example, have a service already, then you don't need to do it twice. But if it is the first service, then this needs to be done. And then there is a process of service registration. The important bit here, if the test environment is implemented, you still need to have somebody in order to register the service, it has to be, so somebody needs to have a government email address and a phone number. But it's essential that this is somebody who is part of the government in order to register even the test environment. We had a hurdle at that point, and we had to identify somebody to actually do it for us. And then you need to provide this information, which I believe pretty much is self-explanatory in most of the cases, but here is where you need to identify what claims you would require to be obtained from your users and what they need to get verified when they register for your service. It can be to various levels of confidence. And I don't think I need to go through the details here. So essentially, just as a conclusion, I think as part of, in the end of the discovery, we think this is a valid and good approach to authenticate to any government service. It works. The group that supports OneLogin is very cooperative, very responsive, and very helpful. And they would, there is not you struggling with the documentation, but they would be, accompany you and support you in if there are any problems encountered on the way. So this was our experience, and what we recommended is to actually implement it. I think at this point I will probably pause for questions. I think I've covered most of the stuff I wanted to cover, so I would invite you to ask any questions.